The townsfolk had whispered for weeks, but no one dared speak too loud. In a land where bullets wrote the law and silence bought survival, one tale seemed too cruel to be true. They said a young woman, barely 20, pure as spring water, untouched by the filth of the world, had been given away to a man no soul in Dodge Creek would approach. The Baron, they called him, though no one knew his real name. Men spat at the ground when they spoke it, women crossed themselves, and children hid behind their mothers' skirts. He owned half the county, from the rolling cattle lands to the mines deep in the mountains. He was said to have hanged a ranch hand once for looking him in the eye. Another rumor said he shot a preacher dead for daring to call him wicked. His money was as endless as the desert sky, and his cruelty, they swore, stretched further still. And yet, when the clock struck midnight on that fateful spring evening, the young woman, Sarah Whitmore, was led by trembling hands into his great black house on the hill. She didn't fight, didn't scream, didn't shed a tear before the eyes of the town. Perhaps she had already shed them all in secret, but what happened behind those walls would shake every soul for miles. Sarah had been raised by her widowed father, a poor prospector who never struck gold. Her mother had died birthing her, and all Sarah ever knew of tenderness came from her father's rough, work-worn hands. He had debts, gambling debts, whiskey debts, debts to the wrong sort of men. And when the Baron made his offer, the kind no sane man could refuse, her father broke. For the promise of cleared ledgers and a sack of coins heavy enough to drown a conscience, he gave his daughter to the richest, darkest man in Dodge Creek. The night she arrived, a storm rolled in. Thunder cracked like rifle shots across the sky, lightning clawed the earth in silver streaks, and the Baron's mansion loomed over her like a beast with 1,000 staring eyes. Sarah stood stiff at the gates, her pale blue dress clinging in the rain, her long hair braided tight to her back. 2 guards pushed her forward, their faces stone. Inside, the house was colder than the storm. The Baron sat in a high-backed chair by the fire, his shadow cast tall on the wall. He was not young, nor terribly old, but his face bore the scars of hard living, and his eyes, those gray, wolfish eyes, burned with something Sarah couldn't name. "So," he said at last, his voice deep as a canyon, "they gave you to me." Sarah said nothing. Her hands were folded tight, white-knuckled at her waist. "Do you know what that means?" The Baron pressed. Still, she gave no answer. Silence was her only weapon, her last scrap of defiance. The Baron studied her, then laughed, a sound so dry and hollow it made the firewood crack louder just to drown it out. "You've spirit. That will do." But that night, he did not touch her. And the next night, he still did not. By the third, the town had begun to whisper again. Men at the saloon swore they'd seen the Baron ride alone at dawn, his jaw tight, his face darker than usual. Some claimed Sarah had cursed him. Others said she'd struck a bargain with the devil himself. Inside the mansion, the truth was stranger still. Sarah, for all her fear, carried a quiet strength. She would rise early, open the drapes, and breathe life into rooms that hadn't seen sunlight in years. She sang while she worked, soft hymns her mother had once taught her father. And though the Baron never asked it of her, she cooked, mended, and tended to the halls as though they were her own. The Baron watched her, at first, with suspicion, then, with unease, and soon, with something he had not felt in decades, shame. "You act like a wife," he said one evening, his voice gruff as. He'd poured himself whiskey. "I act like a woman who has nothing else left," Sarah replied calmly. He stared at her. Most men would have struck her for such a reply. But instead, the Baron turned his glass, staring at the amber liquid as though it held answers he'd long forgotten. It was then the townsfolk began noticing the changes. The Baron no longer rode men into the ground with debts. He no longer barked orders in the saloon or had drifters whipped for stealing scraps. Instead, he stayed at the mansion, unseen, as though the wildfire in him had dimmed. And when he did appear, he carried himself differently. One afternoon, a ranch hand stumbled into Dodge Creek, beaten near to death. He had fled the Baron's land, claiming the Baron himself had spared him after catching him stealing. "Told me to leave, told me not to come back," the man gasped. "Didn't even take the hide off my back." No one believed him, until more stories followed. A miner who'd failed to pay his dues returned home alive. A widow behind on rent found her land untouched. A preacher spoke boldly of repentance, and this time, the Baron only listened from the back pew. But the biggest shock came when people saw him beside her. Sarah, the untouchable girl given away like cattle. She walked into town one Sunday, her arm looped through his. The Baron carried no sneer, no gun at his hip, only the quiet weight of a man humbled. The crowd froze. Even the saloon doors stilled in the wind. No one dared speak, until Sarah did. Her voice was clear, soft but steady. "I am not his property. I am not his prisoner. I walk beside him because I choose to." Gasps rippled through the street. Men whispered curses, women shook their heads, children stared wide-eyed. The Baron's jaw tightened as though bracing for mockery, for hatred, for the stones he surely deserved. But none came. For the first time in Dodge Creek's bloody history, the richest man in the county stood before them not as a tyrant, but as a man laid bare. Behind closed doors, the truth had bloomed slowly. Sarah, with her unbroken spirit, her quiet defiance, her steady gaze, had forced him to see the hollowness of his empire. She had not melted beneath his power, she had turned it to dust. In her presence, his cruelty seemed childish, his riches meaningless. But the town wasn't ready to forgive. One night, a group of men rode to the mansion, guns in hand, vengeance in their hearts. They meant to end the Baron and free the girl they believed was still captive. But when they kicked through the doors, rifles raised, they found Sarah standing in the foyer, calm as the moonlight. "Put them down," she said. The men blinked, stunned. "I'm not leaving," Sarah continued. "I've chosen my path, and if you fire tonight, you'll fire on me too." The rifles lowered, one by one. For who among them could shoot a girl with eyes that pure, a voice that steady? And in that moment, the legend of Dodge Creek changed. For years they had feared the Baron, but now they feared something greater, her. Not for cruelty, not for power, but for the strength she carried in her silence. Some said she'd tamed him. Others said she saved him. A few swore she bewitched him. But the truth, known only to Sarah and the Baron, was simpler. He had been given a woman untouched by the world's filth, and instead of corrupting her, she had cleansed him. The man who once held the county by the throat now held only her hand. And for the first time in living memory, Dodge Creek slept in peace. Yet even peace carries its own shadows. For there were whispers that not every man forgave the Baron's past, that one day the sins he buried would come clawing back. Sarah knew it too, but she also knew this: when that day came, he would not face it alone. And so the story of Sarah Widmore and the Baron became the most shocking tale the West had ever told. Not because of bloodshed, nor betrayal, nor riches stolen in the night, but because no one had believed such a man could change. And yet, beneath the endless sky, with the dust of the frontier at their feet, he had. And all it took was a woman the world thought he would destroy, who instead became the only soul strong enough to save him.